Officer Dan sat alone in his apartment that night, watching the news. Every channel showed his face. Every headline had his name. Officer Dan exposed. Civil rights lawyer breaks her silence. How many others did he hurt? His hands trembled as he turned off the TV. Meanwhile, Ava Montgomery and her legal team were already at work. They began digging through Dan's police history. Within hours, they found something. 3 complaints from Black and Latino men, all saying the same thing: unfair treatment, rough handling. No reason given, but all the reports had been closed quietly. No one had ever followed up. Ava wasn't surprised. This is what they do, she told her team. They bury the truth, but not this time. She held a press conference the next day. Standing in front of reporters, she spoke clearly. I was silent when he arrested me, but I will not stay silent now. This is about justice, not just for me, but for everyone he thought couldn't fight back. One reporter asked, "Do you have proof?" Ava smiled slightly. More than enough. She showed copies of the old complaints, bodycam clips where Dan's voice was angry, forceful, calling people names, pushing them when they didn't resist. The city shook. People who had once been afraid of Dan now came forward. A young mother, a teenage boy, even an old man who had once been stopped for looking suspicious. One by one, they shared their stories. Officer Dan watched helplessly as his secrets came out, one after another. He tried calling his captain, but the department had already started an internal investigation. His own badge was now under threat. And Ava, she was just getting started. The news spread fast. Racist cop arrests civil rights lawyer without cause. It was all over the internet, TV, and social media. People were angry. People were watching. Officer Dan walked into the courtroom the next day, trying to stay calm. But cameras were everywhere. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters held signs outside the building. Inside, Ava Montgomery stood with quiet confidence. She wore a simple black dress and a calm smile. The judge entered the courtroom and looked shocked when he saw Ava. "Ms. Montgomery," the judge said, standing up, "why are you here?" "Because Officer Dan here thought I didn't belong in a public park," Ava answered. "He didn't ask. He assumed. He arrested me with no reason." Dan's lawyer tried to defend him. "Your Honor, the officer was just doing his duty. She had no ID and—" But Ava raised her hand. "I had no ID because I was out for a quiet walk after visiting my father's grave." She paused, and I didn't speak because I wanted to see how far they would go. The judge turned to Dan. "Do you know who this woman is?" Dan shook his head, trying to hide his fear. The judge sighed deeply. "She is one of the most respected civil rights lawyers in the country. She has won cases against entire departments. And she's also my daughter." Gasps filled the courtroom. Dan's face turned pale. His hands started shaking. The judge looked angry now. "You didn't just arrest a woman in a park. You arrested a lawyer. You arrested my daughter. And you treated her like a criminal based on her skin." Dan had no words. He just stared at the floor. The judge ordered Ava's immediate release and cleared all charges. As Ava walked out of the courtroom, she paused beside Dan and whispered, "That was the first step. Now we go deeper." Dan knew it wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Within days, the city streets were full of people. They held signs that said, "Justice for all. We are not silent. Fire Officer Dan." Hundreds marched, then thousands. They weren't just angry about Ava. They were angry about years of unfair treatment. Ava stood on a small stage in the city square. Her voice was strong and steady. "He thought I was alone, but I'm not. And none of us are alone anymore." The crowd clapped and cheered. Behind her stood the families of people Dan had hurt, each one with tears in their eyes. Dan watched it all from home. He couldn't go outside. Protesters stood in front of his building. News vans followed him everywhere. His neighbors avoided him. Even some fellow officers stopped answering his calls. He was becoming the face of everything the people were fighting against. The mayor called an emergency meeting. The police department suspended Dan. Ava didn't smile. She stayed focused. "This isn't about revenge," she said to a reporter. "This is about change." She met with city leaders and demanded new rules. Rules to stop racist behavior in the police force. That same night, a candlelight vigil was held for the victims. People stood side by side, holding hands, lighting candles. Ava walked through the crowd quietly. An old woman touched her arm and said, "My son tried to speak up years ago. No one listened. Thank you for making them listen." Ava nodded gently, holding back tears. But deep down, she knew the fight wasn't over. There was one more truth to uncover, and one more voice that had to be heard. Ava's team received a message one night. It was from a boy, only 17 years old. His name was Tyrell. He wrote, "Officer Dan beat me last year. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just walking home. He told me to run or he'd lock me up. I stayed quiet, but I don't want to stay quiet anymore." Ava met Tyrell the next day. He was quiet, scared, and shaking. He showed her an old photo, his face bruised, his lip cut. His mom had taken it after the incident, but no one ever believed them. Ava gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Are you ready to speak?" He nodded slowly. A few days later, Tyrell stood on live television beside Ava. His voice cracked as he said, "I thought I was going to die that night. Officer Dan looked at me like I was nothing. But I'm not nothing. I'm someone, and I want justice." People across the country watched the broadcast. Some cried, some got angry, but most stood up and clapped in their homes. Dan watched from his apartment, his face pale. He turned off the TV, but it was too late. Tyrell's story went viral. Ava's team sent the photo and testimony to Internal Affairs. This time, the department couldn't ignore it. They reopened the case. Dan was called in for questioning, not as an officer, but as a suspect. He tried to defend himself. He said, "I was just doing my job." But Ava walked in during the session and said coldly, "Your job? Hurting a child is not your job. It never was." Dan looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he looked scared. Very scared. Because now, he was the one being hunted by the truth. Officer Dan stood in court. This time, not in uniform. He wore a plain suit. His hands were shaking. His eyes were tired. He wasn't the proud man from before. He looked like someone who had finally been caught. Across the room sat Ava Montgomery, calm and steady, just like before. Tyrell sat behind her, holding his mother's hand. Other victims were there too, people who once felt small and afraid. Now they felt strong. The judge read the charges: abuse of power, racial profiling, excessive force, tampering with reports. Dan tried to speak, but his lawyer told him to stay quiet. Ava stood up and faced the courtroom. This case is not just about one man. It's about a system that allowed him to hurt people for years. But those days are over. Because now, truth has a voice, and justice has a name. She paused. "My name is Ava Montgomery, and I will never be silent again." The courtroom clapped quietly, some wiping away tears. The judge found Dan guilty on multiple counts. His badge was taken away forever. He was sentenced to time behind bars. But more than that, his name was now known for what he had done, not for the power he once thought he had. Outside the courtroom, people gathered, not to celebrate, but to breathe, to believe that things can change. A little girl walked up to Ava and asked, "Are you a hero?" Ava smiled and said softly, "No, I'm just someone who didn't give up. One day, you'll do the same." As Ava walked away, the sun broke through the clouds. A new day had begun, and the city would never be the same again. At the police station, Officer Dan walked in proudly. He felt powerful, like he did something great. He threw the woman's purse on the desk and said, "She had no ID, no license, nothing." The other officers looked at her. She was calm, too calm. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just sat there with her hands folded on her lap. "What's your name, lady?" one officer asked. She smiled softly and said, "You'll find out soon." Dan laughed loudly. "Oh, we'll find out all right, after fingerprinting and a background check." But even after hours, nothing came up. No ID, no name, no criminal record. It was like she didn't exist. Dan started getting nervous but didn't show it. "Maybe she gave us fake info," he said, trying to act cool. But inside, his heart was beating fast. The next morning, a man in a sharp black suit walked into the station. He didn't look scared. He looked angry. He walked straight to the desk and said, "I'm Attorney James Carter. I'm here for Ms. Montgomery." "Who?" Dan asked, confused. The lawyer looked him in the eye. "Ava Montgomery, the woman you arrested without cause. You don't know what you've done." Dan's smile disappeared. "She didn't tell us her name," one officer said nervously. "She didn't need to," the lawyer replied. "But now she will." Everyone watched as the woman stood up slowly. She looked straight at Dan and finally spoke clearly. "My name is Ava Montgomery, and your world is about to change." Dan froze. He had heard that name before. Ava Montgomery. She was famous. But for what? And why was she here? What happened next would shake the whole department.